a bit about your early life and how you came to be an agricultural economist.
Okay, so I grew up in a really small town in Ontario, not on a farm at all, but my father had grown up on a farm. And I think he talked longingly about the farm, but that was about all my connection. The real trick for me was that I couldn't stand living in the small town, and I found out that you could go to the University of Guelph in Canada in May. You didn't have to actually finish high school and wait till September, and to me that was very attractive. So I headed off with rosy ideas about being a marine biologist at an inland Canadian university, which was just the place to study marine biology. And I hated it. It was more and more memorization and categorization, and I thought, God, this is terrible. And I found out I could switch into agriculture and get credit for all my science credits, so I jumped ship. And my first agricultural economics class, I thought, this is for me. We were, the department, or the faculty at that point at the University of Guelph had just hired a whole bunch of people, some bright American people who were bringing in all kinds of empirical tools, and some British people who were really solid on traditional policy analysis. And I thought, this is all about why the price of beef is the way it is. This is for me. It was something about being tangible, and you could relate it to the grocery store, you could relate it to other things. That's a clue. I've always focused on the consumer, and to a much greater extent, although I do farm stuff as well. But so I loved it, and I worked, and I mean on research projects when I wasn't actually in school, and I got to near the end of my undergraduate degree, and I thought, I'm not entirely sure I actually know enough yet to really head out in a job and start telling the government what to do about policy, because I was offered a job in the provincial government at that point. I was also interestingly offered a job at a big steel processing plant who thought that the analytical skills we got out of agricultural economics would be perfect for projecting steel prices. And I thought, oh, well, you know, that. And then I thought, no, I really need to do a master's. And there was money and interesting policy questions, and I started working on livestock industries, the beef and pork industries. I don't think I've ever left those industries in the entire rest of my career. And I loved it. And so we were, it's funny to think about now, but in Canada, one of the biggest agricultural policy issues is around supply management, which we have for dairy and feather industries. And at that point, they were proposing to have it for beef and pork industries as well. And so my research was about why not to. And then I thought, oh, okay, I've now lived in Guelph for long enough, now what? And when I was getting near the end of my master's degree, there was a lot of foreign students there, including 2 or 3 Australians, and they said, well, you know, you can do a PhD in Australia. And I thought, okay, that seems like an idea, because Ames, Iowa didn't sound that much better than Guelph in those days. So I headed off to Australia. I had no idea where I was going or really anything at all. And I arrived at La Trobe University and thought, really, I'm really here. I'm going to live on $4,000 a year, and I'm a long way from home, and I'm not even sure I'm going to survive. But so that's how I got here, and I kept on working on beef. So my PhD thesis was about international beef trade, which of course had relevance for Canada as well as Australia, and I loved that. But it was an interesting time to be a grad student.
Can we locate this in time? What year would this have been?
I started doing my PhD in 1980. I finished my master's degree somewhere like March of '79, and then I worked on research projects, and then I came here. And
who supervised you at La Trobe?
Professor John Freebairn supervised me, and I think he was a little bit stunned about, anyway, for a variety of reasons when I arrived. But my one of my best friends at Guelph was Gary Griffith.
Yep.
And Gary and John and a number of other people who had been through the New South Wales Department of Ag were very close friends, and I assume Gary said, "You'll probably survive if you let her come and be a PhD student," and I did. And it was a great. The thing that was the best for me was that it was such a nice, strong cohort of people. So there was
Who else was there?
Jeff Edwards and John Quilke and Rob Dumsday and Freebairn were kind of the economist people.
Yeah.
But there were really interesting people on the ag side, vets and animal scientists and a weed guy that became one of my closest friends. And so when I really didn't know what was going on in agriculture, I could go and ask them without always having to sound silly in front of my supervisor. The language was very foreign.
Yeah.
I will say, though, that as a grad student, I was overwhelmed at how much more welcoming or seriously, I can't describe it, but I gave papers at conferences. And you know, the first time I went to a conference, I think it was in Sydney, and I gave a paper. And Professor Keith Campbell wrote me a really long email with really good comments after I gave my paper, and I thought, oh my goodness, like I'm this little person, and I was super impressed by that.
Yeah. Some other interviewees have commented on Keith's tendency to do things like that.
And it just increases your learning, and it makes you more confident to ask questions and talk. And I really found that at a professional level, I never felt any judgment, really. I think people were a bit bemused about why this person who sounded American was studying in Australia, perhaps. And there weren't very many women, but I really never felt that was a barrier to standing up. In Canada, practically the only people that spoke at Canadian Ag Econ conferences in those days were full professors and it was a very closed shop, and you were there to listen and know your place and not contribute in a significant way. It was a completely different feeling around the room, and I think that I was always ecstatic that I'd come here, because without that I mean, I'm not a big talker at the best of times, this sort of environment not being considered, but I wouldn't have had any confidence at all if I'd stayed in the Canadian environment, which seemed very hierarchical and not welcoming to students at all. So
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
And not much like the States was at that time. I mean, the American Ag Econ profession has always been so big that it's a little bit intimidating on that perspective, but much more welcoming to younger people, and has, you know, laterally really focused. But I found it was easier to get on here in Australia. I never really had Australian female counterparts to ask if it was different for them. But I mean, because I could have got some kind of buy for being foreign, but anyway, for me personally, it was really important, because otherwise, no confidence, no speaking, no going to conferences for quite a while.
So that begs the question, do you think it's changed in Canada now?
To a certain extent. I'm always disappointed that I don't see why, when you look at, I mean, I've personally trained about over 100 grad students, and they're all positioned in governments, and not all in Canada, of course, lots of them have gone home, but to other countries, but a lot of them. So I never go to a meeting that there's not an ex-grad student in the room. And sometimes they start speaking, and I hadn't realized they were there, and it's a bit of a shock when they say, oh, you know, my supervisor's sitting over there. But I do not feel that it's as welcoming, and I do not feel that they are as connected to the Canadian Ag Econ Society as people generate connections here.
Could you speculate how much of it is sort of an institutional culture versus a national culture?
I wondered about that. I I always thought that the no worries philosophy in Australia was positive for that sort of interaction, and I saw it in when I tutored undergraduate classes, and I would watch how the professors interacted with the students in undergraduate classes. And I don't think the students ever felt not legitimate, if you like. I think my professors here enjoyed teaching. Some of them are still teaching, so I guess they must really like teaching. But in Canada, there was always a distance, and it was much more formal. You had to make an appointment, and so